The wind smelled like gunpowder and burning hair. Evelyn Mercer pressed her palm against the dirt and felt the earth still trembling from hoofbeats that had vanished an hour ago. Around her, the remains of the wagon train lay scattered like a child's abandoned toys, overturned wheels, shredded canvas, trunks spilling calico and silverware into the mud. Bodies lay where they'd fallen. Some faced the sky. Others didn't have faces anymore. She'd stopped crying 20 minutes after it started. Crying required breath, and she'd spent that currency screaming. Now there was only silence, the kind that pressed against eardrums and made a person notice how loud their own heartbeat sounded. Evelyn rose on unsteady legs, her ruined dress catching on sage and thistle. The fabric had been cream-colored that morning, French lace at the collar, seed pearls sewn by her mother's own hands over 6 winter evenings in Philadelphia. Now it was the color of rust and smoke, torn open at the shoulder where someone had grabbed her, ripped at the hem where she'd run. She'd been running when the bullet struck the man beside her. His name had been Douglas. Douglas Penworth. She'd met him twice before the journey west, once at her father's office, where he'd signed the marriage contract with hands that smelled like pipe tobacco, and once at the docks, where he'd tipped his hat and promised her father she'd want for nothing in the Wyoming territory. He'd kept that promise in the worst possible way. Now she wanted for everything. Evelyn picked her way through the wreckage, boots crunching on broken glass. The sun was falling fast, painting the plains in shades of amber and ash. She had no sense of direction out here, no landmarks that meant anything. In Philadelphia, you navigated by church steeples and street signs. Here, the land rolled on forever, indifferent and identical. "Hello?" Her voice came out hoarse, scraped raw from screaming. She tried again, louder. "Is anyone alive?" A groan answered from beneath an overturned wagon. Evelyn's heart kicked against her ribs as she scrambled toward the sound, dropping to her knees beside the wreckage. A man lay pinned beneath the wagon's frame, middle-aged, weathered face, blood soaking through his shirt at the ribs. "Help me?" he rasped. She braced her shoulder against the wagon and pushed. It didn't budge. She tried again, boots slipping in the dirt, and managed to lift it perhaps an inch before her strength gave out. "I can't." The words tasted like failure. "I'm not strong enough." The man's eyes found hers, fever bright and fading. Water. She had none. She'd watched her canteen tumble away during the attack, lost somewhere in the chaos. She looked around desperately, spotted a tin cup lying near a dead woman's hand, and crawled toward it. The cup held perhaps 2 swallows of water, already collecting dust. She brought it back and tilted it against the man's cracked lips. He drank, coughed, and managed something that might have been gratitude or a curse. She couldn't tell which. "They came from the east," he whispered. "Not west. East." Evelyn frowned. "What does that mean?" "Means they weren't." He coughed again, blood flecking his beard. "Weren't who they wanted us to think." Before she could ask what he meant, his eyes went distant and still. She sat back on her heels, the empty cup hanging from her fingers. 2 survivors, then. Her and no one. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Evelyn knew enough about the frontier to understand what that meant. Tracks would wash away, evidence would vanish, and she'd be alone under a Wyoming sky with no shelter and no supplies. She forced herself to stand. Think. She'd read books about the West, hadn't she? Dime novels full of brave pioneers and noble savages. What did they do when stranded? Find water, find shelter, find help. The first 2 seemed impossible. The third felt like asking for a miracle. But staying here meant dying here, so Evelyn began to walk. She chose north because it felt less empty than the other directions, though she had no real reason to believe that. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, scattered copses of cottonwood, distant ridges that might have been mountains or might have been clouds. After an hour, her legs began to shake. After 2, she stopped feeling them entirely. The sun touched the horizon and bled across the sky like a wound. Evelyn's throat was sandpaper. Her lips had cracked and started bleeding. Every breath tasted like copper and dust. She'd just decided to stop, to simply sit down and wait for whatever came next, when she saw the rider. He appeared on the ridge line to the west, a dark silhouette against the dying light. Man and horse, motionless, watching her. Evelyn's first instinct was to run. Her second instinct was to recognize she had nowhere to run to, so she stood there, swaying slightly, and waited. The rider descended the slope at an easy walk, in no particular hurry. As he drew closer, details emerged. A tall man in a weathered duster, wide-brimmed hat pulled low, rifle resting across his saddle. His face was hidden in shadow, but his posture spoke of someone comfortable with violence and long silences. He stopped his horse 10 feet away and studied her for a long moment. "You're the only one," he said finally. Not a question. Evelyn found her voice. "Yes." "You hurt?" "I don't think so." He swung down from the saddle with practiced ease and moved toward her. Evelyn took an involuntary step backward, and he stopped immediately, raising one hand palm out in a gesture of peace. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm not with them." "Them? Whoever did this?" He gestured back the way she'd come, though the wagon train was no longer visible from here. "I saw the smoke. Came to see what burned." Evelyn's legs chose that moment to give out. She sat down hard in the dirt, her vision swimming. The man moved quickly, kneeling beside her and pressing a canteen into her hands. "Slow," he warned. "You drink too fast, you'll be sick." She ignored him and gulped greedily, coughing when the water hit her raw throat. He was right. Her stomach immediately threatened rebellion. She forced herself to slow down, taking small sips, and gradually the world stopped tilting. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded and settled back on his heels, giving her space. "Name's Cole Brennan. I scout for the fort sometimes. Hunt, mostly. You got people expecting you somewhere?" "I was supposed to marry a man in Salvation Ridge." The words came out flat, factual. "Douglas Penworth. He's dead now." "Penworth?" Brennan's voice carried a note she couldn't identify. "The land speculator." "I don't know what he was. My father arranged it. I met him twice." Brennan was quiet for a moment, then stood and offered his hand. "Can you ride?" Evelyn let him pull her to her feet. "I've never been on a horse in my life." Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "You're about to learn. Salvation Ridge is 20 miles northeast. We can make it by dawn if we push, but not if you're walking." He led her to his horse, a rangy buckskin mare with intelligent eyes, and helped her into the saddle. She sat there awkwardly, clutching the saddle horn while Brennan swung up behind her, his arms coming around to grip the reins. "Lean back," he instructed. "If you fight the horse's rhythm, you'll be sore for a week." They rode through the gathering darkness, and Evelyn tried not to think about how strange this was, pressed against a man she'd met 5 minutes ago, trusting him because she had no other choice. In Philadelphia, this would be scandalous. Here, it was simply survival. "The man who died told me something," she said after a while. "He said the raiders came from the east, not the west. He said they weren't who they wanted us to think." "What does that mean?" Brennan's silence stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Means there's more than one kind of trouble in this territory," he said finally, "and not all of it comes from where people expect." "You're being cryptic." "I'm being careful. You'll understand why when you see Salvation Ridge." They rode on through the night, the mare's hooves steady on the hard-packed earth. Evelyn dozed fitfully, her head dropping against Brennan's shoulder, then jerking upright when she realized what she'd done. He never commented on it. Dawn broke gray and cold, revealing a landscape of rolling grassland broken by sandstone outcrops. In the distance, Evelyn saw buildings, low wooden structures clustered around a main street, smoke rising from chimneys. "That's Salvation Ridge," Brennan said. It looked nothing like Philadelphia. No brick, no cobblestones, no church steeples reaching toward heaven. Just rough timber and canvas, buildings that seemed to crouch against the wind like they expected to be blown away any moment. As they rode down the main street, people stopped to stare. A woman hanging laundry, a man shoeing a horse, children playing in the dirt. All of them watching Evelyn with expressions ranging from curiosity to something harder to name. Brennan guided the mare to a stop in front of a 2-story building with a painted sign reading Hale Ranch and Mercantile. "Margaret Hale runs this place," he said, helping Evelyn down from the saddle. "She's got a spare room and doesn't ask questions she knows won't be answered. Tell her I sent you." "You're leaving?" I brought you to civilization such as it is. What happens next is your business, not mine." He tipped his hat and turned the mare back toward the street. "Wait." Evelyn's voice came out sharper than she intended. "The man who died. He tried to tell me something important. Don't you want to know what happened?" Brennan looked back at her, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "I already know what happened," he said quietly. "Question is whether you're ready to hear it." Before she could respond, he was gone, the mare's hoofbeats fading into the morning sounds of the waking town. Evelyn stood alone in the street, covered in dried blood and prairie dust, her ruined wedding dress drawing stares from every direction. She had no money, no belongings, no idea what to do next, so she climbed the steps to Margaret Hale's door and knocked. The woman who answered was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that assessed Evelyn in 3 seconds flat. She wore men's trousers and a flannel shirt, and her hands were calloused from work. "You're the girl from the wagon train," she said. News traveled fast, apparently. "Yes, ma'am." "Only survivor?" "Yes, ma'am." Margaret Hale nodded slowly, then stepped aside. "Come in. You look like you need coffee and a bath, in that order." The interior of the building was sparse but clean, a general store on the ground floor, living quarters above. Margaret led Evelyn upstairs to a small kitchen where a pot of coffee sat warming on the stove. "Sit." Evelyn sat. Margaret poured 2 cups and settled across the table, studying Evelyn with the same frank appraisal she might give a horse she was considering buying. "Cole Brennan brought you in," she said. "That's a point in your favor. He doesn't help people who aren't worth helping." "I don't know if I'm worth anything." The words came out before Evelyn could stop them. "I was supposed to be a bride. Now I'm just here." "Being here is more than most people manage after what you went through." Margaret sipped her coffee. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want a straight answer. You understand?" Evelyn nodded. "Do you plan to die, or do you plan to live?" The bluntness of it hit like a slap. Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it, then found words. "I don't want to die." "That's not the same thing as choosing to live." Margaret set down her cup. "Living out here requires work, real work, not the kind that means embroidering pillowcases or managing servants. It means hands bleeding and back aching and doing things you thought you couldn't do. If you're willing to work, I'll give you a room and 3 meals a day. If you're not, I'll find you a stage ticket east and you can go back to whatever you left behind." Evelyn thought about Philadelphia, about her father's house with its gas lamps and servants, about the marriage he'd arranged to clear his gambling debts, about the future that had been planned for her without her consent. "I'll work," she said. "Good." Margaret stood. "Finish your coffee, then get cleaned up. You start this afternoon." The room Margaret showed her to was small and plain. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window overlooking the street. After the chaos of the past day, it felt like a palace. Evelyn stripped off the ruined wedding dress and left it in a heap on the floor. She washed with cold water from the basin, scrubbing dried blood from her skin until she was raw and clean. The face that looked back at her from the small mirror above the washstand belonged to a stranger, hollow-eyed, sunburnt, marked by something that hadn't been there before. She looked like someone who'd survived. Margaret provided plain clothes, a work dress of sturdy cotton, an apron, boots that were slightly too large. Evelyn dressed slowly, her muscles protesting every movement. When she came downstairs, she found Margaret rearranging sacks of flour in the store. "You've got good posture," Margaret said without preamble. "That'll help with carrying heavy loads. Start by organizing those shelves, everything alphabetical, labels facing out. When you're done, there's inventory to count in the back room." The work was mind-numbing and exactly what Evelyn needed. She lost herself in the rhythm of it, lifting, sorting, stacking. Her hands quickly developed blisters. She ignored them. By evening, her back ached and her feet throbbed, but the shelves were immaculate. Margaret inspected her work with a critical eye, then nodded. "You'll do." They ate dinner in the kitchen, salt pork, beans, cornbread. Simple food that tasted better than anything Evelyn could remember eating in Philadelphia. "You'll hear talk in town," Margaret said as they ate, "about the wagon train, about what happened. Most of it will be lies." "What kind of lies?" The kind that serves certain people's interests. Margaret buttered her cornbread methodically. You said the man who died told you the raiders came from the east? Yes. He seemed to think it was important. It is. Most folks around here assume any violence comes from the west. Cheyenne, Sioux, Arapaho. Easy to blame, convenient to believe. Margaret's voice was flat. Truth is more complicated. What's the truth? That's what you'll have to figure out for yourself. But I'll give you this much. Salvation Ridge isn't what it pretends to be. We've got a sheriff who drinks more than he works, a mayor who's more politician than leader, and men with money who'd rather keep things unstable than profitable. Chaos serves some people very well. Evelyn absorbed this slowly. Why are you telling me? Because you're going to hear offers. Margaret met her eyes across the table. Men in this town who will see a young woman alone and think opportunity. They'll offer marriage, offer protection, offer security. What they're really offering is ownership. I want you to understand that before you hear their pretty words. I won't marry anyone. Good. Keep that thought close. Margaret stood and began clearing dishes. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start early. Evelyn climbed the stairs to her small room and lay down on the narrow bed. Through the window she could see stars, more stars than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia, where city lights washed them away. She thought about Douglas Penworth, lying dead in the prairie grass, about the life she was supposed to have lived as his wife, about her father in Philadelphia, who'd probably already spent the money from the marriage contract and wouldn't refund it just because the groom was dead. She thought about the dying man's words. They came from the east, and she thought about Margaret's warning, chaos serves some people very well. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Closer, she heard the sound of men's voices raised in argument, then laughter. The frontier settling in for another night. Evelyn closed her eyes and felt sleep pulling at her like a tide. Tomorrow she'd begin learning how to survive in this hard country. How to work until her hands bled and her back screamed. How to navigate a town full of secrets and lies. Tomorrow she'd begin the transformation from bride to something else entirely. But tonight, she simply let the darkness take her, grateful to have survived one more day. The first week passed in a blur of physical labor. Evelyn hauled flour sacks that weighed more than she did. She scrubbed floors until her knees were bruised. She learned to build a fire that would last all night, to make coffee strong enough to strip paint, to count inventory without losing her place. Margaret was a demanding teacher, offering no praise and little patience for mistakes. But she was fair and she kept her word. 3 meals a day, a roof overhead, work that had purpose. The people of Salvation Ridge remained watchful and wary. Some were kind. The blacksmith who tipped his hat when she passed. The elderly woman who ran the boarding house and always smiled. Others were predatory. Men who watched her with calculating eyes. Women who whispered behind their hands. On the 8th day, a man named Thomas Garrett came into the store. He was perhaps 35, well-dressed by frontier standards, with smooth hands that suggested he'd never done manual labor in his life. He bought tobacco and paid with silver coins, counting them out slowly while his eyes followed Evelyn around the store. "You're the girl from the wagon train," he said. It wasn't a question, but Evelyn answered anyway. "Yes." "Terrible business, that. You have my sympathies." "Thank you." He pocketed his tobacco, but made no move to leave. "I heard you were engaged to Douglas Penworth." "I was." "Unfortunate man. He owed me a considerable sum of money, you know, a land deal that went sideways." Garrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't suppose you'd be interested in honoring his debts." Evelyn felt Margaret's presence behind her, silent but solid. "I have no money," she said carefully. "No property, no means to honor anyone's debts." But you have something more valuable than money." Garrett's gaze traveled down her body and back up, making her skin crawl. "You have youth and potential. I'm a man of some means in this town, Miss Mercer. I could offer you security, comfort, a future. All I'd ask in return is companionship." The silence stretched thin and dangerous. "The lady isn't interested," Margaret said from behind the counter, "and you've overstayed your welcome." Garrett's smile hardened. "I was speaking to Miss Mercer, not you, Margaret. And I'm speaking to you. Get out." For a moment, Evelyn thought he might argue. Then something in Margaret's posture, the way her hand rested casually near the shotgun beneath the counter, convinced him otherwise. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Another time, perhaps. When he was gone, Evelyn realized her hands were shaking. "That was Thomas Garrett," Margaret said quietly. "He owns half the businesses in town and most of the land around it. He's also a coward who uses money instead of fists to get what he wants. He wanted to buy me. He wanted to lease you. There's a difference, though not much of one." Margaret came around the counter. "He'll be back, and he'll bring others. Men who'll dress it up as courtship or charity, but it'll all mean the same thing. You need to decide now how you're going to respond." "I'll say no." "Good. But saying no has consequences out here. Garrett's the kind of man who doesn't like being refused. He'll make things difficult." "Let him try." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got spine. That'll help, but spine alone won't keep you safe. You need to understand how this town works, who holds power, who wants it, and who's willing to shed blood for it." Over the next few days, Margaret began teaching Evelyn things that had nothing to do with running a store. She explained that Salvation Ridge existed because of three things: cattle, silver, and land speculation. The cattle drives came through twice a year, bringing money and violence in equal measure. The silver mine in the hills employed 50 men and produced ore that made a few people very rich. And the land speculators like Garrett bought up territory and sold it to settlers at inflated prices. "Power here isn't about law," Margaret said one evening as they cleaned up after closing. "It's about leverage. The sheriff's paid by the town council, and the town council's bought by Garrett and men like him. The judge visits once a month and mostly rubber stamps whatever he's told. Real power belongs to whoever controls the money and isn't afraid to use violence to protect it." "That's not civilization," Evelyn said. "That's chaos with a thin coat of paint." "Now you're starting to understand." That night, Evelyn lay awake listening to the sounds of the town, distant music from the saloon, dogs barking, the occasional gunshot that made her flinch. She thought about the wagon train, about the raiders who'd come from the east instead of the west. She thought about Thomas Garrett's calculating eyes and the way he'd looked at her like property to be acquired. And she thought about Margaret's words. "Real power belongs to whoever controls the money and isn't afraid to use violence." Somewhere in the darkness, she heard hoofbeats, fast, urgent, fading into the distance. Something was happening in Salvation Ridge, something that had been building long before Evelyn Mercer arrived in a blood-stained wedding dress. And whether she wanted to or not, she was becoming part of it. The gunshot woke her 2 hours before dawn. Evelyn sat upright in bed, heart hammering, the echo still ringing in her ears. For a disorienting moment, she was back in the wagon train, watching men fall, hearing screams cut short. Then the familiar outline of her small room emerged from the darkness, and she remembered where she was. Salvation Ridge, Margaret's spare room. Safe, or as safe as anywhere in this territory. She moved to the window and looked down at the street. A knot of men had gathered outside the saloon, their faces lit by lantern light. Voices carried up through the cold air, angry and urgent, though she couldn't make out words. A knock on her door made her jump. "Get dressed," Margaret's voice came through the wood. "Something's happened." By the time Evelyn came downstairs, Margaret had coffee brewing and was loading the shotgun she kept behind the counter. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. "Don't know yet. But when men gather like that before sunrise, it's never good news." Margaret checked the shotgun's chamber with practiced efficiency. "Stay inside. Lock the door behind me." "Where are you going?" "To find out what happened before the lies get too far ahead of the truth." Margaret left, and Evelyn stood alone in the darkened store, listening to the sounds of the town stirring to life earlier than usual. She paced for 10 minutes, then gave up on staying inside and followed Margaret out into the street. The crowd had grown larger. Evelyn worked her way to the edge of it, catching fragments of conversation. Found him in the ravine. Shot twice, once in the back. His horse came back without him. A woman pushed past Evelyn, sobbing, and was caught by another woman who held her while she wept. The crowd parted slightly, and Evelyn saw what they were gathered around, a body laid out on a wooden door that had been torn off its hinges and used as a makeshift stretcher. The dead man wore a deputy's badge. Margaret stood near the front of the crowd, talking quietly with the blacksmith. She saw Evelyn and shook her head sharply, a clear warning to stay back. But Evelyn had already seen enough. The deputy had been young, maybe 25, with sandy hair now matted with dried blood. A man climbed onto a wagon bed to address the crowd. Evelyn recognized him from Margaret's descriptions. Mayor Ashford, 60 years old and soft around the middle, wearing a vest that probably cost more than most people in town earned in a month. "Folks, please," he called out, raising his hands for quiet. "I know you're scared and angry. Deputy Miller was a good man and this is a tragedy, but we can't let fear turn us into a mob." "Who did it?" someone shouted from the back. "We don't know yet. Sheriff Dalton is investigating." "Where is Dalton?" another voice interrupted. "Sleeping off last night's whiskey?" Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Ashford's face tightened. "The sheriff will make a statement when he has facts to share. Until then, I'm asking everyone to remain calm and let the law do its work." "The law?" a man near Evelyn muttered. "What law? We got a drunk for a sheriff and one deputy who couldn't defend himself." The crowd began to disperse, breaking into smaller groups that gathered on corners and in doorways, voices low and urgent. Evelyn made her way to Margaret, who was heading back toward the store. "I told you to stay inside," Margaret said without heat. "You also told me chaos serves some people very well. This feels like chaos." Margaret glanced at her sharply, then nodded. "You learn fast. Come on." Back in the store, Margaret poured them both coffee and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep blue. "That boy was the only honest lawman in this town," Margaret said quietly. "Young, but honest. Rode out yesterday evening to check on the Henderson ranch after they reported missing cattle. And someone killed him for it? Someone killed him because he was looking in the wrong direction. Or the right direction, depending on how you see it." Margaret cupped her hands around her coffee. "Those cattle weren't stolen by Indians, Evelyn. They were driven off by white men who wanted it to look like Indians. Same thing that happened to your wagon train." The words hit like a physical blow. Evelyn set down her cup carefully. "You're saying the wagon train attack was staged?" "I'm saying the raiders who hit you weren't Cheyenne or Sioux. No matter what people will tell you, the pattern's wrong. Wrong time of year, wrong tactics, wrong direction of approach. What happened to you was meant to look like an Indian raid, but it was white men wearing war paint and carrying arrows they bought. Or stole." "Why?" "Because fear is profitable. Scared settlers sell their land cheap. Scared cattlemen pay for protection. Scared townspeople demand more soldiers, more guns, more money spent on defense." Margaret's voice was hard and tired. "And all that money flows through certain hands before it gets where it's going, if it ever gets there at all." Evelyn thought about the dying man's words, about raiders coming from the east, about Thomas Garrett's smooth hands and calculating eyes. "Garrett," she said, "among others. He's got partners, men who control freight contracts, supply chains, land offices. They've been working this territory for 3 years now, getting rich off instability while pretending to be pillars of the community. Then why doesn't someone stop them? Because proving it means staying alive long enough to gather evidence. Deputy Miller was probably killed because he found something, or was about to." Margaret stood and moved to the window. "Now they're down to just Sheriff Dalton, who's either complicit or too drunk to notice what's happening under his nose. Someone has to do something. Someone does, and that someone ends up like Miller, face down in a ravine." Margaret turned back to face her. "I'm telling you this so you understand what you're walking into. Garrett's going to come back with his offer, and when you refuse him again, things are going to get difficult. He doesn't like being told no, and he's got the power to make your life very hard." "I don't care." "You should. This isn't Philadelphia, where you can appeal to authorities or social pressure. Out here, might makes right, and Garrett has a lot of might." The store opened late that morning. Margaret hung a sign in the window, and they spent the day doing inventory, both of them moving quietly through the routine tasks, while the town buzzed with speculation outside. Evelyn learned more about Salvation Ridge through the customers who came and went. The Henderson ranch that had lost cattle was owned by a widow who was barely holding on after her husband died in a mining accident. The deputy who'd been killed had a sister who worked as a school teacher and a mother who'd already buried 3 children. The sheriff, who was supposed to be investigating, hadn't been seen since the body was brought in. By evening, the story had crystallized into something simple and comfortable. Deputy Miller had been killed by Cheyenne raiders who were getting bolder, and the town needed to demand more protection from the territorial government. No one mentioned that the Cheyenne were 200 miles north, dealing with their own troubles. No one asked why raiders would kill a lone deputy and leave his body where it would be easily found, when they could have simply avoided him. No one questioned the convenient timing of an attack that would justify increased military presence and all the government contracts that came with it. Or if they did question it, they kept their mouths shut. 3 days after Miller's death, Cole Brennan came back to town. Evelyn was sweeping the store's front steps when she saw him ride in, the same buckskin mare moving at an easy walk down the main street. He dismounted outside the saloon, tied his horse, and stood for a moment studying the town like he was reading a book written in a language only he understood. Then he turned and walked directly toward Margaret's store. "Miss Mercer," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Brennan." "Margaret inside?" "Yes." He went in without knocking, and Evelyn followed, curious despite herself. Margaret was behind the counter, updating her ledger. She looked up when Brennan entered and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, maybe old friendship. "Cole?" "Heard about Miller. Figured you would." Brennan leaned against the counter, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. "Heard some other things too. Heard there's talk of forming a citizen militia. Heard Garrett's been buying up land from scared settlers at half price. Heard someone tried to burn down the Henderson place last night, and the widow barely got out alive." Margaret's pen stopped moving. "I hadn't heard that last part. Happened around midnight. She's staying with the Reverend's family now, what's left of her belongings in a trunk." Brennan's voice was flat, but anger simmered beneath it. Fire was set deliberately, 3 different points of origin. "Anyone investigating?" Sheriff Dalton took a statement, said it was probably an accident, maybe a lamp got knocked over. 3 lamps got knocked over? That's what he said. Margaret closed her ledger slowly. "It's worse than I thought." "It's exactly as bad as you thought. You're just seeing it all at once now, instead of spread out." Brennan glanced at Evelyn. "Miss Mercer, you might want to step outside for this conversation." "No," Margaret said before Evelyn could respond. "She stays. She's got a right to know what's happening, especially since Garrett's already marked her." Brennan raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He pulled up a chair and sat down, and Margaret did the same. Evelyn stood near the counter, listening. "There's a pattern to what's happening," Brennan said. "Started about 6 months ago. Small incidents at first, missing cattle, broken fences, supply wagons arriving late or not at all. Then it escalated. Raids blamed on Indians, settlers getting scared and selling cheap, businesses closing because they can't get goods. Each time, Garrett or one of his associates swoops in with a solution: protection for a fee, land purchases at reduced prices, supply contracts that only his freight company can fill. Classic land grab, Margaret said. Create the problem, sell the solution. Exactly. But it's bigger than just Garrett. He's got partners, men in Denver, maybe even further east. They're using Salvation Ridge as a testing ground for something they plan to roll out across the territory. How do you know this? Because I've been tracking them, following their money, watching their movements, listening to conversations they don't know I'm hearing. Brennan's face was hard. Miller found out about a shipment, guns and ammunition, that were supposed to go to the fort but got diverted. He was going to report it when someone put 2 bullets in him. Do you have proof? Evelyn heard herself ask. Both of them looked at her. Physical evidence, she clarified. Something that could be shown to a judge or a marshal, not just suspicion and patterns. Brennan studied her for a long moment. You think like someone who's read law books. My father was a lawyer before he became a gambler. I learned a few things. Then you know proof means nothing if the people who judge it are corrupt. We could have a wagon full of evidence and Sheriff Dalton would find a way to lose it or explain it away. Brennan stood and moved to the window, looking out at the street. What we need isn't proof, it's leverage. Explain, Margaret said. Garrett and his partners only have power because nobody's pushed back hard enough to make them worried. They've gotten comfortable, sloppy. They think they own this town so completely that they can do whatever they want. Brennan turned back to face them. We need to make them afraid. Make them think their whole operation is about to come apart. Force them into making mistakes. That's a good way to get killed, Margaret pointed out. Miller got killed for doing nothing but his job. At least this way we'd be choosing the fight instead of waiting for it to come to us. Evelyn listened to them talk strategy, about which ranchers might be convinced to band together, about whether the territorial marshal could be trusted, about supply routes and money trails, and men who owed favors or held grudges. It was like watching chess players discuss a complicated endgame, each move dependent on the next. Finally, Margaret held up a hand. Before we plan a war, we need to know who we're fighting with. Cole, you said ranchers might help. Which ones? Ben Foster, maybe. His place borders Garrett's land, and he's been fighting fence cutting for months. Sarah Chen, if we can convince her it's not suicide, she runs the freight company that's losing contracts to Garrett's outfit. There's a few others, but most are too scared or already bought. What about the town council? Ashford's in Garrett's pocket. So are 3 of the other 5 members. The remaining 2 might be honest, but they're outnumbered and they know it. Marshal service? There's a deputy marshal named Harding who rides circuit through here. He's honest from what I can tell, but he's one man covering 500 square miles. Even if we got word to him, he couldn't do much without evidence that would stand up in territorial court. Margaret drummed her fingers on the table. So we're looking at a long game. Gather evidence, build alliances, wait for Garrett to make a mistake big enough that even the bought judges can't ignore it. That's one approach, Brennan said. The other is to hit him where it hurts, his money. Make his operations unprofitable, convince his partners that Salvation Ridge is more trouble than it's worth. Men like Garrett are only loyal to profit. Take that away and they scatter like rats. How do we do that? We start by protecting the people he's trying to squeeze out. The Hendersons, the Fosters, anyone else who's being pressured to sell. We make it expensive for him to keep pushing. Bodyguards cost money. Replacing burned buildings costs money. Buying off more people to cover up bigger crimes costs money. We don't have money, Evelyn said quietly. Both of them looked at her again. We might not have money, she continued, but we have something else. Information. Garrett thinks he knows everything that's happening in this town, but he doesn't know what we know. He doesn't know you've been tracking him, Cole. He doesn't know Margaret's been keeping records. He doesn't know I was on that wagon train and heard what the dying man said about raiders coming from the east. Margaret's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. She's right. Garrett's operating on the assumption that everyone's either too scared or too stupid to connect the pieces. The moment he realizes people are asking questions, comparing notes, seeing patterns, that's when he becomes vulnerable. It's also when he becomes most dangerous, Brennan warned. Cornered men do desperate things. Then we need to make sure we're not the ones cornered when it happens. They talked until late in the evening, voices low, planning carefully. Evelyn listened more than she spoke, learning how frontier justice worked when official justice had been bought and sold. It was nothing like the law her father had practiced in Philadelphia, where everything happened in courtrooms with proper procedure. This was rougher, more personal, balanced on the edge of violence. When Brennan finally left, slipping out the back door to avoid being seen, Margaret locked up and turned to Evelyn. You understand what you're getting into? She asked. I think so. This isn't your fight. You could get on a stage east, go back to Philadelphia, forget any of this happened. Evelyn thought about that, about returning to her father's house, to the life of arranged marriages and debts paid with daughters, about being safe and powerless and owned. No, she said, I couldn't. Margaret smiled slightly. Good, because we're going to need you. Over the next 2 weeks, Evelyn learned a different kind of work. Margaret taught her how to listen to customers' conversations and remember details that seemed unimportant. How to notice when someone came into the store asking casual questions that weren't casual at all. How to read the patterns in who bought what. Sudden purchases of rope and kerosene, bulk orders of supplies that didn't match a ranch's usual needs. Men paying in cash instead of credit when they'd always used credit before. Information is currency out here, Margaret explained one evening as they reviewed the day's observations. Maybe more valuable than gold or silver, because you can't steal information the way you can steal money. Once you know something, it's yours forever. Evelyn began to see Salvation Ridge differently. What had seemed like a simple frontier town revealed itself as a complex web of relationships, debts, loyalties, and fears. The blacksmith who was kind to her was also supplying iron to Garrett's mining operation. The woman who ran the boarding house smiled sweetly but reported everything she heard to Mayor Ashford. The gambler who played cards at the saloon every night was actually a Wells Fargo detective investigating freight robberies. Everyone was something other than they appeared, including, she realized, herself. She wasn't the frightened girl in a ruined wedding dress anymore. She was someone who counted inventory while listening to men discuss cattle prices and heard the lies beneath their words. Someone who swept floors while watching who came and went, noting times and companions. Someone who served coffee and smiled and remembered everything. Thomas Garrett came back to the store on a Tuesday afternoon, bringing flowers. "Miss Mercer," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I wanted to apologize for my forward behavior during our last meeting. I fear I may have offended you." Evelyn set down the sack of beans she'd been shelving. "No offense was taken, Mr. Garrett." "I'm glad to hear it. I also wanted to extend another invitation. There's a social gathering at the mayor's house this Saturday evening. Music, refreshments, respectable company. I'd be honored if you'd allow me to escort you." Before Evelyn could respond, Margaret emerged from the back room. "Miss Mercer has plans Saturday evening," she said flatly. "She'll be helping me with inventory." Garrett's smile tightened fractionally. Surely inventory can wait. A young woman shouldn't spend all her time working. She needs opportunity to meet people, to integrate into the community. She's integrated just fine. With all due respect, Margaret, you're not her mother or her guardian. Perhaps Miss Mercer should speak for herself. The air in the store felt suddenly charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Evelyn stepped forward. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Garrett, but I'm afraid I must decline. As Mrs. Hale said, I have prior commitments." "I see." Garrett set the flowers on the counter with exaggerated care. "That's unfortunate. I'd hate for people to think you're being kept isolated, prevented from making your own choices." "No one's preventing anything," Margaret said, her voice hard. "The lady made her choice. You do well to respect it." Garrett looked between them, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled again, picked up his flowers, and headed for the door. "Give my regards to Cole Brennan next time you see him," he said over his shoulder. "Tell him I've been hearing interesting things about his activities." When he was gone, Margaret let out a long breath. "That was a threat," she said. "I know. He knows we're gathering information, which means someone's been talking, or he's been watching more carefully than we thought." Margaret moved to the window and looked out at the street. "We need to warn Cole." But Cole Brennan didn't need warning. He was already 3 steps ahead. That night, after the store closed, he came through the back door with a canvas sack slung over his shoulder. Inside were ledgers, thick books bound in leather, their pages covered in columns of numbers and dates. "Where did you get these?" Margaret breathed, handling them like they were made of gold. "Garrett's warehouse office. He thinks nobody knows about his secondary set of books, the ones he doesn't show the tax assessor." Brennan's face was grim. "These go back 3 years. Every fraudulent land deal, every diverted shipment, every payment to corrupt officials. It's all here." Evelyn leaned over Margaret's shoulder, scanning the pages. Even to her untrained eye, the fraud was obvious. Cattle purchased for prices that didn't match market rates. Supply shipments billed but never delivered. Land sales where the same property was sold 3 times to different buyers. "This is enough," she said. "This could bring him down." "Maybe," Brennan said, "if we can get it to someone who'll act on it. But we have another problem. Garrett's going to know these are missing by morning, which means we have maybe 12 hours before things get very dangerous very fast." Margaret looked up from the ledgers. "How dangerous?" "The kind where people start dying to protect secrets." Brennan pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I also found this. It's a telegram sent 2 days ago to someone in Denver. It says, 'Problem with local witness. Recommend permanent solution.'" The words hung in the air like smoke. "Witness to what?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. "To the wagon train raid. To what really happened out there." Brennan's eyes met hers. "You're the only survivor, Evelyn, which makes you the only person who can testify that those raiders weren't Indians. You're evidence, and evidence needs to be eliminated." The room seemed to contract around her. "They're going to kill me," she said, hearing the words from a great distance. They're going to try, Margaret corrected, which is why you're not staying here anymore. Cole's going to take you somewhere safe while we figure out what to do with these ledgers. No. Evelyn's voice came out stronger than she felt. I'm not running again. I ran from Philadelphia. I ran from the wagon train. I'm done running. This isn't about courage, Brennan said quietly. This is about staying alive long enough to see Garrett answer for what he's done. Then we make him answer now, tonight. We take these ledgers to the marshal. We tell him everything. We force him to act before Garrett can destroy the evidence or eliminate the witnesses. The nearest marshal is 2 days' ride from here, Margaret pointed out. We'd never make it. Garrett would have men on our trail within hours. Then we don't go to the marshal. Evelyn felt something crystallizing inside her, a decision, a commitment, a line crossed. We bring the marshal here. We make this public, make it loud, make it impossible to ignore. If Garrett's power comes from operating in shadows, we drag everything into the light. Brennan and Margaret exchanged a long look. How? Margaret asked finally. Evelyn thought fast, remembering her father's courtroom strategies, remembering how he'd once won a case by forcing his opponent to defend in public what they'd done in private. The social gathering at the mayor's house, she said. Saturday evening, respectable company, Garrett said, which means the town council, local business owners, maybe even the territorial judge if he's making his monthly visit. You want to confront Garrett in public? I want to present evidence in front of witnesses who can't be bought or scared into silence. Make them see the ledgers, hear the testimony, understand what's been happening. Force the honest ones to choose a side before Garrett can threaten or bribe them. That's insane, Brennan said, but he was smiling slightly. Completely insane and just bold enough it might work. Margaret was already moving, pulling out paper and pen. We'd need to copy the most damaging pages from these ledgers. We'd need statements from people who've been hurt by Garrett's schemes. We'd need protection. If he tries to stop you, things could get violent. I'll handle protection, Brennan said. I know some men who owe me favors. Good men who'll stand up if they see others standing first. And I'll get the statements, Margaret added. The Henderson widow, Ben Foster, Sarah Chen. They'll talk if they know they're not alone. They worked through the night, copying numbers and dates, drafting statements, building a case from fragments and fury. Evelyn's hand cramped from writing, but she didn't stop. This was her chance to transform from victim to witness, from evidence to be eliminated into testimony that couldn't be silenced. As dawn broke over Salvation Ridge, painting the eastern sky in shades of copper and flame, they had what they needed. 4 days until Saturday evening, 4 days to prepare, to gather allies, to set the trap. 4 days until Evelyn Mercer walked into the mayor's house and bet her life that truth could still matter in a town built on lies. Wednesday morning arrived with a cold wind that rattled windows and sent dust devils spinning down the main street. Evelyn woke before dawn, her mind already racing through the plan they'd constructed during the long night. 4 days felt simultaneously like too much time and not nearly enough. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Margaret already at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her while she stared at the copied ledger pages spread across the worn wood. Couldn't sleep either? Evelyn asked. Margaret looked up, her face drawn with exhaustion. Keep thinking about what happens if this goes wrong. If Garrett figures out what we're planning before Saturday, or if his men come for you before we can make it public. Then we fight. You say that like you know how. I'm learning. Evelyn poured herself coffee and sat down. What's our next move? Cole's riding out to the Foster Ranch this morning to talk with Ben. If we can get him on our side, that's one more voice, one more witness. I'm meeting with Sarah Chen at noon. She's scared, but she's also lost 3 major freight contracts to Garrett in the past 6 months. Fear makes people cautious, but loss makes them angry. What about the Henderson widow? Margaret's expression darkened. That's trickier. She's staying with the minister's family, and the minister is cautious about anything that might bring violence to his doorstep. We'll need to approach her carefully, privately. Evelyn studied the ledger pages, seeing patterns in the numbers that told stories of theft and manipulation. One column showed payments labeled as security services that coincided exactly with raids on ranches that later sold their land at reduced prices. Another tracked shipments of goods that were billed to the fort but never arrived, The difference presumably pocketed by Garrett and his partners. He's been stealing from the army, she said, tapping one page. Federal property, federal money. That's not just territorial law, that's something a federal marshal would have to investigate. If we can prove it, Margaret said, and if we can get word to a federal marshal before Garrett's friends in Denver make it all disappear. The territorial judge who visits monthly, when's his next circuit? Week after next, usually. Why? Because if we can't get to a marshal in time, maybe we can make sure the judge sees evidence he can't ignore. Force his hand in front of witnesses. Margaret considered this. Judge Blackwood's old school. He doesn't like being pushed, but he also doesn't like being made a fool of. If we can show him proof that he's been rubber-stamping fraud for months without knowing it, his pride alone might make him act. They spent the morning preparing, sorting documents, rehearsing what would be said and when. Every sound from the street made Evelyn tense, expecting Garrett's men to come crashing through the door. But the morning passed quietly, almost too quietly. Just before noon, Cole Brennan returned. He came through the back door, moving quickly, and Evelyn knew immediately something had changed. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. Margaret set down the papers she'd been organizing. "What kind of problem?" "Ben Foster's dead. Found him this morning in his barn. They made it look like an accident. A horse spooked, kicked him in the head. But Foster was one of the best horsemen in the territory. His horses didn't spook." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of implication through everything they'd planned. "Garrett knows," Evelyn said quietly. "Garrett suspects," Brennan corrected. "He knows someone's asking questions, gathering allies. Foster must have talked to the wrong person or been seen meeting with someone he shouldn't have been meeting with. Either way, they're cleaning up loose ends. Then we're running out of time faster than we thought." Margaret stood and moved to the window, scanning the street. If they killed Foster to send a message, they're not going to stop there. Anyone who might testify, anyone who knows too much, they're all targets now. "Which means we move up our timeline," Evelyn said. "We can't wait until Saturday." Both of them turned to look at her. "She's right," Brennan said after a moment. "The longer we wait, the more danger everyone's in. But if we move too fast, we won't have enough people gathered to make this work. We need witnesses. We need credibility. We need—" He stopped as a new sound reached them from the street. Hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast. Brennan moved to the window beside Margaret, and Evelyn saw his hand drop to the gun at his hip. "How many?" Margaret asked quietly. 6 riders, coming straight down the main street." Brennan's voice was tense. "And they're headed this way." Evelyn felt her heart kick into a faster rhythm. She moved away from the window, positioning herself where she could see the door, but wouldn't be immediately visible from outside. The hoofbeats stopped in front of the store. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then boot heels hit the wooden sidewalk, spurs jingling, and the door swung open. Thomas Garrett walked in, followed by 2 men Evelyn didn't recognize. Both wore guns and had the hard-eyed look of men who knew how to use them. "Margaret," Garrett said pleasantly. "Mr. Brennan? And Miss Mercer. How convenient to find you all together." Margaret's hand was beneath the counter, no doubt resting on the shotgun she kept there. "Store's closed for inventory, Garrett. Come back later." "I'm afraid this can't wait." Garrett's smile was thin and cold. "You see, I had something stolen from me recently. Business records, personal property. And I have reason to believe the thief might have brought those items here." "That's a serious accusation," Brennan said, his voice deceptively mild. "You got proof?" "I have what I need." Garrett gestured to his men. "Search the place." "Like hell you will," Margaret said, pulling the shotgun up and leveling it at Garrett's chest. "This is private property. You and your dogs get out now, or I'll make sure they carry you out." The 2 gunmen reached for their weapons, but Brennan was faster. His pistol cleared leather in a blur of motion, aimed at the nearest man. "Nobody moves," he said quietly. "Nobody dies today unless you make it necessary." Garrett held up his hands in a placating gesture, though his expression remained calm. "Let's not be hasty. I simply want what belongs to me. Return my property, and we can all go about our business." "I don't have any property of yours," Margaret said. "No, then you won't mind if my associates take a look around." "I mind very much. And if you try it, someone's going to bleed on my clean floors." The standoff held, tension stretched wire-tight. Evelyn watched Garrett's face, seeing the calculations running behind his eyes. He was weighing options, measuring risks, trying to decide how far he could push before something broke. The sound of more horses outside shifted the balance. Garrett's smile widened slightly. "It appears my other men have arrived. 4 more, in case you're wondering. Now we can do this the hard way, with bullets and bodies and questions from the territorial marshal about why a respectable businessman was shot while investigating a theft. Or we can do this the civilized way, where you return my stolen property and we all pretend this misunderstanding never happened." "There's a third option," Evelyn heard herself say. Everyone turned to look at her. She stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "You leave now, Mr. Garrett, and we don't share with the entire town what your ledgers reveal about your business practices. We don't tell them about the fraudulent land deals, the stolen army supplies, the payments to men who stage raids dressed as Indians." Garrett's expression went very still. "That's a dangerous game you're playing, Miss Mercer. No more dangerous than the one you've been playing with people's lives and livelihoods." Evelyn forced herself to meet his eyes. "You want your ledgers back? Fine. Come to the mayor's social gathering on Saturday evening. Come in front of witnesses, in front of the town council and the territorial judge if he's visiting. Bring your lawyers, bring your explanations. We'll have a civilized discussion about property and theft and what exactly those numbers mean." "You're bluffing," Garrett said, but she heard uncertainty beneath the words. "Try me. Send your men to search this store, and I'll walk down to the saloon right now and start reading these ledger entries out loud to anyone who'll listen. See how many of your business partners want to stay partners once they know you've been skimming from every deal, keeping 2 sets of books, paying off Sheriff Dalton with money that was supposed to go to the town's treasury." Margaret made a sound that might have been approval or surprise. Brennan's gun didn't waver, but she saw his mouth quirk slightly. Garrett stared at her for a long moment, and Evelyn saw him really seeing her for the first time, not as a helpless girl to be bought or controlled, but as an actual threat. "Saturday evening," he said finally, "the mayor's house. We'll discuss this matter in a civilized fashion." "Looking forward to it." He turned and walked out, his men following. Through the window, Evelyn watched them mount up and ride away, their posture radiating fury barely held in check. When they were gone, Margaret let out a long breath and lowered the shotgun. "That was either very brave or very stupid," she said. "Probably both," Evelyn admitted. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline catching up with her. "But we couldn't let him search the store. If he'd found those ledgers, he would have destroyed them and killed all of us," Brennan finished. "You bought us time, maybe 3 days, maybe less. Garrett's going to use that time to prepare his defense, gather his allies, make sure everyone who might testify against him is too scared or too dead to open their mouths. Then we do the same. We gather our people, we prepare our case, and we make sure when Saturday comes, we have enough truth and enough witnesses that Garrett can't buy or threaten his way out of it." Margaret was already moving, gathering the ledger copies into a canvas bag. "These need to be hidden somewhere safer than here. Cole, you still have that cabin up in the hills?" "Nobody knows about it except you and me." "Then that's where these go. Evelyn, you're going with him." "No," Evelyn said immediately. "I'm not hiding while you and Cole take all the risks." "You're not hiding, you're protecting evidence. If something happens to us, you're the one who knows where the ledgers are, what they mean, who to give them to." Margaret's voice was firm. "Besides, Garrett just got a good look at you standing up to him. He's going to be watching this store, watching me. But if you're not here, if you've disappeared, that's going to make him nervous. Nervous men make mistakes." Evelyn wanted to argue, but she could see the logic. And more than that, she could see the determination in Margaret's eyes. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from someone who'd been fighting this fight longer than Evelyn had been in the territory. "How long?" she asked. 2 days? 3 at most. We'll send word when it's safe to come back." Margaret handed the canvas bag to Brennan. "Keep her alive, Cole. We're going to need her testimony when this is over." "I'll keep her alive," Brennan said quietly. "But she's going to have to do what I say, when I say it. No arguments. That understood, Miss Mercer?" Evelyn nodded, though part of her bristled at being told what to do. Still, she'd learned enough about the frontier to know that survival sometimes meant trusting people who knew the land better than she did. They left through the back door as full dark settled over Salvation Ridge. Brennan led his mare by the reins, moving quietly through alleys and backlots, avoiding the main street where Garrett's men would be watching. Evelyn followed, wearing one of Margaret's old riding skirts and a coat that smelled like smoke and sage. At the edge of town, Brennan helped her mount, then swung up behind her just as he'd done that first night. But this time Evelyn wasn't half dead from thirst and shock. This time she was alert, aware of every sound and shadow, every place where an ambush might be waiting. They rode north into the hills, following a trail that was barely visible in the starlight. The mare picked her way carefully over rocks and through narrow passages between sandstone outcrops. After an hour, Evelyn had lost all sense of direction. Everything looked the same. Dark shapes against darker sky, the smell of juniper and dust, the sound of wind moving through grass. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. "Old mining claim about 5 miles from here. Built a cabin there 2 years ago when I was tracking a fugitive through this country. Nobody uses it anymore except me and the occasional mountain lion." "Mountain lions?" She felt him shrug behind her. "They mostly mind their own business if you mind yours." They rode in silence after that. Evelyn tried to stay alert, but exhaustion from the sleepless night was catching up with her. Her head drooped forward, jerking back up when she started to slide sideways in the saddle. "Lean back," Brennan said, the same instruction he'd given that first night. "I've got you." This time she didn't fight it. She let herself rest against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, and drifted into something that wasn't quite sleep, but wasn't full wakefulness either. When the mare stopped, Evelyn opened her eyes to find they were standing in front of a small structure built into the side of a rocky hillside. Calling it a cabin was generous. It was more of a dugout with a wooden front, low and weathered and nearly invisible against the surrounding terrain. Brennan dismounted and helped her down, then led the mare to a lean-to shelter built against the rocks. Inside the cabin, he struck a match and lit a lantern, revealing a single room with a wood stove, a narrow bunk, a table, and not much else. "Not exactly the Ritz," he said. "It's perfect." And it was. Isolated, defensible, unknown to anyone who might want to find them. Brennan got a fire going in the stove while Evelyn explored the small space. There were supplies in crates beneath the bunk: dried beans, coffee, salt pork, ammunition. A rifle hung on pegs above the door. A shelf held a few battered books, a deck of cards, and what looked like a journal. "You spend a lot of time here?" she asked. "When I need to disappear for a while, or when town gets too loud." He filled a pot with water from a barrel outside and set it on the stove to boil. "We'll stay here until Margaret sends word it's safe. Could be tomorrow, could be 3 days. You'll have to make peace with boredom and beans." "I've made peace with worse." They ate a simple meal of hardtack and jerky. Then Brennan laid out bedrolls, one on the bunk, one on the floor. "You take the bunk," he said. "I'll be fine down here." "I can sleep on the floor." "You could, but you won't. I've been sleeping rough for 20 years. One more night won't kill me." Evelyn wanted to argue on principle, but she was too tired. She lay down on the bunk, fully clothed, and pulled the blanket up to her chin. The stove ticked as metal cooled. Outside, an owl called into the darkness. "Mr. Brennan?" she said into the quiet. "Cole? We're past formality at this point. Cole, then. That first night when you found me on the prairie, you said you already knew what happened to the wagon train. What did you mean?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "I'd been tracking the men who did it," he said finally, "following their movements for weeks, trying to figure out their pattern. I knew an attack was coming, knew they'd stage it to look like Indians. What I didn't know was which wagon train they'd hit, or when exactly it would happen. By the time I figured it out and got there, everyone was dead except you." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You knew it was coming and you couldn't stop it?" "I knew something was coming. I didn't have enough specifics to warn anyone, didn't have proof that would convince a territorial marshal to act. All I had was suspicion and patterns." His voice was rough with old guilt. "I've been carrying that since the day I found you, wondering if I'd moved faster, thought harder, push the right people in the right ways, maybe those people would still be alive. Evelyn stared at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, processing this. You can't blame yourself for what evil men chose to do. Can't I? Out here, the line between complicit and powerless gets awful thin sometimes. Is that why you're helping us now? To make up for what you couldn't prevent then? Partly. Also because Margaret's a friend and Garrett's a cancer that needs cutting out before he spreads further. She heard him shift position in the darkness. And partly because I watched you stand up to 6 armed men this afternoon without flinching, and I figure anyone with that much spine deserves backup. Evelyn smiled despite everything. I was terrified. Being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing what needs doing anyway. She thought about that as sleep finally pulled her under, thought about Douglas Penworth, dead in the grass before she'd ever really known him, about Deputy Miller, shot for asking the wrong questions, about Ben Foster, killed in his own barn by men who made it look like an accident, about all the violence that happened in shadows, explained away, covered up, forgotten. Not this time, she promised herself. This time, the truth would come out, no matter what it cost. She woke to the smell of coffee and weak sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window. Cole was already up, sitting at the table with the ledger copies spread in front of him. Morning, he said without looking up. Coffee's on the stove. Bacon's in the pan if you want it. Evelyn poured coffee and sat across from him, studying the papers that had bought them this strange sanctuary. Finding anything new? Connections. See here? He pointed to a series of entries. These payments for consultation services all go to the same recipient in Denver. I'd bet money that's where Garrett's main partner is. Someone with political connections, maybe federal contracts. This isn't just a local operation. It's bigger than Salvation Ridge, which makes it more dangerous and more important to expose. If we can prove Garrett's part of a larger conspiracy to defraud the government and terrorize settlers, that brings in federal authorities. That's when men like him actually face consequences. They spent the morning going through the ledgers line by line, building a narrative from the numbers. Evelyn found herself thinking like her father had taught her, seeing cases and facts, arguments and evidence. Each entry told a story. Each pattern revealed intent. By afternoon, they had what amounted to a prosecution case. Not perfect, not complete, but damning enough that even bought judges would have trouble explaining it away. Cole was copying key passages into his journal when they heard it, hoofbeats on the trail below. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, moving to the window. Evelyn joined him, peering through a gap in the rough shutters. 2 riders were approaching, moving slowly, clearly searching. Garrett's men? She whispered. Can't tell yet. Stay back from the window. The riders came closer, and Cole's posture relaxed fractionally. It's all right. I know one of them. He stepped outside, rifle lowered but ready. Evelyn watched through the window as he spoke with the riders, men she didn't recognize, weathered and hard-looking but not hostile. After a brief conversation, one of them handed Cole a folded paper. Cole read it, his expression darkening, then sent the riders on their way. When he came back inside, his face was grim. Margaret sent word. Sarah Chen's freight warehouse burned last night. Total loss. The fire marshal's calling it arson, but Sheriff Dalton's claiming it was an accident. Lamps stored too close to hay. Evelyn felt her stomach drop. Is Sarah all right? She's alive. Staying with friends, too scared to talk to anyone about what she knows. Cole set the note on the table. Garrett's cleaning house. Everyone who might have testified, everyone who might have stood against him, he's either silencing them or scaring them silent. What about the Henderson widow? Still safe, as far as Margaret knows. The minister's family is well connected enough that even Garrett's hesitant to move against them directly. Cole ran a hand through his hair. But it's only a matter of time. We're losing allies faster than we can protect them. Then we move now, tonight. We don't wait for Saturday. And do what? We can't take these ledgers to Sheriff Dalton. He's on Garrett's payroll. The nearest honest lawman is 2 days' ride, and we'd never make it out of the territory alive if Garrett knows we're coming. So we make noise, Evelyn said, the plan forming even as she spoke. We make so much noise that Garrett can't silence all of it. We tell everyone, every rancher, every shopkeeper, every person in Salvation Ridge who's been hurt by his schemes. We flood the town with truth faster than he can contain it. Cole stared at her. That's insane. And incredibly dangerous. More dangerous than sitting here waiting for him to pick us off one by one? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to smile. A hard, dangerous smile that reminded Evelyn he was a man who'd survived by his wits and his gun and country that killed the careless. You know what? He said. Let's burn it all down. They rode back to Salvation Ridge under cover of darkness, taking a different trail than they'd used to leave. Cole moved them carefully, stopping often to listen, watching for signs of ambush or pursuit. When they reached the edge of town, he pulled the mare to a stop. Last chance to change your mind, he said quietly. Once we start this, there's no going back. People will die. Might be us, might be Garrett's men, might be innocent folks caught in the crossfire. You ready for that wait? Evelyn thought about the wagon train burning, about Douglas Penworth's body in the grass, about Deputy Miller face down in a ravine, about Ben Foster, killed by a horse that didn't spook, about Sarah Chen's warehouse reduced to ash and lies. I'm ready, she said. They entered town from the north, avoiding the main street. Cole took her to a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Chen, Sarah's mother, it turned out, and a woman who'd been quietly gathering her own evidence against Garrett for months. You're the girl from the wagon train, Mrs. Chen said when she opened the door to Cole's knock. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. The one who survived. Yes, ma'am. My daughter's upstairs. She's afraid, but she's angry too. Anger's good. Anger means you fight instead of fold. Mrs. Chen stepped aside. Come in. We need to talk. In the boarding house parlor, they found not just Sarah Chen, but 6 other people. Ranchers who'd lost cattle, merchants who'd lost contracts, a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident that wasn't quite as accidental as the report claimed. All of them had pieces of the story. All of them had evidence. None of them had been brave enough to speak alone. Together, though, Mrs. Chen said, looking around the room, together we might be enough. Cole laid out the ledger copies on the table. Sarah Chen added shipping manifests that showed goods billed but never delivered. A rancher named Tom Wilson produced bills of sale for cattle that had been stolen by Indians but somehow ended up in Garrett's private stock. The widow whose husband had died brought a letter he'd written the day before the accident, describing safety violations at the mine and threats he'd received for reporting them. Piece by piece, the full picture emerged. Not just isolated incidents of fraud or violence, but a systematic campaign to control the territory through fear, theft, and corruption. How do we make this public? Sarah asked. If we go to Sheriff Dalton, we don't go to Dalton, Evelyn interrupted. We go everywhere else, the saloon, the mercantile, the blacksmith shop. We tell our stories to anyone who'll listen. We flood this town with truth before Garrett can plug all the leaks. He'll come after us, Tom Wilson said quietly. He's already killed to keep his secrets. A few more bodies won't trouble his conscience. Then we make sure there are witnesses, Cole said. We do this in daylight, in public places, with crowds around. Make it impossible for him to silence everyone without showing his hand. They planned through the night, dividing responsibilities, rehearsing stories, preparing for violence, because violence was coming whether they prepared for it or not. By morning, they were ready. Evelyn stood on the steps of the boarding house as dawn broke over Salvation Ridge, watching the town wake up. Shopkeepers opening their doors, horses being led to the blacksmith, the stagecoach arriving from the north. Somewhere in this town, Thomas Garrett was waking too, making his own plans, gathering his own forces, confident in the power he'd built through blood and fraud. He didn't know it yet, but his comfortable world was about to collapse. Evelyn thought about the frightened girl in the ruined wedding dress who'd stumbled into this town 3 weeks ago. That girl was gone, burned away by everything that had happened since. The woman who remained was harder, sharper, forged in prairie fire and ready to fight. Let's go, she said to the others gathered behind her. Time to tell the truth. They walked down the main street just after sunrise, a group of 8 moving with quiet determination through morning light that painted everything gold and amber. Evelyn led them, her spine straight and her chin up, refusing to show the fear that twisted in her stomach like barbed wire. People stopped to stare. A woman hanging laundry. 2 men loading a wagon. Children on their way to the schoolhouse. all of them watching this strange procession with expressions ranging from curiosity to alarm. Their first stop was the general store, not Margaret's, but the larger one owned by a man named Samuel Price, who'd built his business on staying neutral in all disputes. He was sweeping his front steps when they arrived. "Mr. Price," Evelyn said, "we'd like to speak with you and anyone else who'll listen." Price looked at the group, his weathered face unreadable. "About what?" "About Thomas Garrett, about what he's been doing to this town, and what we can prove he's done." Price's hand tightened on his broom handle. "That's dangerous talk, Miss Mercer." "The truth usually is." For a long moment, Price didn't move. Then he set his broom aside and stepped back from the door. "Come inside. But if you're lying or stirring up trouble for no good reason, I'll throw you out myself." They filed into the store, and Price locked the door behind them, flipping the sign to "closed." Within minutes, word had spread. Sarah Chen went out the back door and returned with 3 more merchants, all of them wearing expressions of nervous interest. Tom Wilson fetched 2 ranchers who'd been buying supplies at the feed store. Mrs. Chen appeared with the boarding house cook and a seamstress who did work for half the town. By the time Cole Brennan laid the ledger copies on Price's counter, there were 20 people crowded into the store. "Some of you know pieces of what I'm about to tell you," Evelyn began, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. "Some of you have lived through parts of it, but I don't think anyone knows the whole story until we put all the pieces together." She told them about the wagon train, about the dying man's words that the raiders came from the east. She told them about Deputy Miller, shot in the back while investigating stolen cattle. She told them about Ben Foster, killed by a horse that didn't spook, and Sarah Chen's warehouse burned the night before she was supposed to testify. Then Cole took over, walking them through the ledger entries, payments for security services that coincided with raids, supply shipments that were billed but never delivered, land sales where properties changed hands 3 times in a month at prices that made no economic sense. "This isn't just bad business," Cole said, his finger tracing a column of numbers. "This is systematic fraud designed to terrify settlers, steal from the government, and concentrate land and wealth in the hands of a few men. Thomas Garrett at the center, but he's got partners. Men in Denver, maybe further east, who are using Salvation Ridge as a testing ground for something they plan to expand across the territory." Samuel Price leaned over the ledger, his face gone pale. "These numbers, I've seen invoices that match some of these. Supplies I was told went to the fort but never did. I thought it was just military inefficiency." "It's theft," Sarah Chen said quietly. "And when my mother tried to compete for those freight contracts, suddenly her wagon started having accidents. Wheels breaking, horses going lame, drivers getting jumped on the road. We couldn't prove anything, but we knew." "My husband knew," the widow said, her voice trembling but firm. "He knew the mine wasn't safe, knew corners were being cut to maximize profit. He wrote to the territorial inspector, and 3 days later he was dead. They said a support beam collapsed, called it tragic and unavoidable. But he'd told me the night before that someone had threatened him, told him to keep his mouth shut or there'd be consequences." The room had gone very quiet. Evelyn watched faces change as understanding dawned. The scattered incidents they'd all witnessed or experienced weren't random misfortune. They were part of a pattern, a deliberate campaign of violence and corruption. "Why are you telling us this now?" asked one of the ranchers, a grizzled man named Jack Sutter. "Why not go to the law?" "Because the law is bought," Cole said bluntly. "Sheriff Dalton's on Garrett's payroll. Look here." He pointed to another ledger entry. "Monthly payments labeled as administrative fees. Same amount every month for 2 years, paid to an account that I'd bet my horse belongs to our good sheriff." "Then we go to the territorial marshal," someone suggested. "And how do we get these ledgers to the marshal when Garrett's men are watching the roads?" Mrs. Chen asked. "My daughter barely survived when they burned her warehouse. You think they'll let evidence like this just ride out of town?" "So what's your plan?" Samuel Price asked, looking at Evelyn. "You gather us here, tell us all this, and then what? We all just wait to see who Garrett kills next?" Evelyn took a breath. "We make it impossible for him to operate in silence. We spread this information to everyone in town, every merchant, every rancher, every family that's been hurt by what he's done. We make the truth so public, so widely known, that he can't contain it. And when the territorial judge arrives next week, We make sure he hears testimony from so many witnesses that even if he wanted to ignore it, he couldn't. Judge Blackwood won't act without solid evidence, Price said. He's cautious. Always has been. Then we give him evidence he can't dismiss. Cole gathered up the ledger copies. These numbers, plus testimony from everyone in this room, plus physical proof of the crimes, the letter from the dead miner, the shipping manifest, the bills of sale for stolen cattle. We bury him in evidence. Jack Sutter shifted his weight, his hand resting on his gun belt. And when Garrett comes for us, because he will come, he's not going to just let this happen. Then we stand together, Evelyn said. He can threaten one person, silence one witness, but he can't silence a whole town without showing exactly what he is. And once he does that, once he reveals himself in front of everyone, he loses the respectable mask that's been protecting him. The room erupted in argument, some people insisting it was too dangerous, others saying they'd been waiting for someone to stand up to Garrett for years. Voices rose and fell, fear and anger mixing in equal measure. Finally, Samuel Price raised his hand for quiet. When the room settled, he looked at Evelyn with something like respect in his weathered eyes. My store's been here 23 years, he said. I've stayed neutral in every dispute, kept my head down, minded my business. And in those 23 years, I've watched this town get meaner and more scared. I've watched good people leave or die, watched corruption take root like poison oak. He paused. I'm too old to keep pretending I don't see what's happening. Count me in. One by one, others agreed. Not everyone. 3 people left rather than commit to action, but enough. Enough to matter. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Samuel Price would spread word to the other merchants. Tom Wilson and Jack Sutter would ride to every ranch within a day's journey, bringing people to town for a gathering on Friday evening. Mrs. Chen would coordinate testimony from families who'd lost members to suspicious accidents. Sarah would document the freight contracts that had been stolen through intimidation and fraud. And Evelyn would do what she'd been doing since she arrived in Salvation Ridge. She'd watch and listen and remember everything. By the time they left the store, the sun was high and hot, burning away the last cool traces of morning. Evelyn walked back toward Margaret's mercantile with Cole beside her, hyper-aware of every shadow and alley where an ambush might be waiting. They were halfway there when they saw the smoke. Margaret's store was burning. Evelyn broke into a run, Cole keeping pace beside her. People were already gathering, shouting, throwing buckets of water that did nothing against flames that had clearly been burning for a while. The entire front of the building was engulfed, black smoke pouring through shattered windows. "Margaret!" Evelyn screamed, trying to push through the crowd. Cole grabbed her arm, holding her back. "You can't go in there." She might still be inside." "If she is, she's already gone. That fire's been burning for an hour at least." But even as he said it, Evelyn saw a figure emerge from the smoke around the back of the building. Margaret, her face black with soot, coughing violently but alive. She was dragging something, and when she got clear of the smoke, Evelyn saw it was the canvas bag containing the original ledgers. Relief hit Evelyn so hard her knees almost buckled. Margaret collapsed on the ground, still coughing, and several people rushed forward with water. She drank, coughed more, then looked up at Evelyn with eyes that blazed with fury. "Garrett's men," she managed, "came in through the back while I was upstairs, poured kerosene, struck matches, and rode off laughing." "Did you see who?" "2 of them. I recognized one, a gun hand named Vance, who works out of Garrett's ranch." Margaret struggled to her feet, refusing help. "They thought I was trapped upstairs." "Would have been, except I keep a rope ladder under my bed for exactly this kind of situation." The fire brigade had arrived with their pump wagon, but it was too late. The building was a loss, flames consuming decades of Margaret's work in minutes. They focused on keeping the fire from spreading to neighboring structures, creating a perimeter of wet wood and beaten earth. Evelyn stood with Margaret and watched everything burn. The store where she'd learned to work, the kitchen where they'd planned their resistance, the small room where she'd slept and felt safe for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. All of it gone. "He's declared war," Margaret said quietly. "No more pretense, no more playing civilized. He's going to kill everyone who knows too much, burn everything that holds evidence, and dare anyone to prove he's responsible." "Then we hit him back," Evelyn said. "Harder than he hit us." Cole appeared at her shoulder. "I've got men watching Garrett's ranch and his warehouse in town. If he makes a move, we'll know about it. He's already made his move, Margaret said, gesturing at the burning building. This is him showing us what happens when we push back. Next it'll be the boarding house, or the ranches, or anyone else who stands with us. No, Evelyn said with a certainty that surprised her. Next it'll be him explaining to the whole town why he ordered this fire. Come on. She started walking toward the mayor's house before anyone could stop her. Behind her, she heard Cole swear and Margaret laugh, a harsh coughing sound that held more approval than amusement. They caught up with her before she'd gone 50 yards. You planning this, or just making it up as you go? Cole asked. Both. Mayor Ashford's house sat at the end of Main Street, a two-story structure that was grand by frontier standards, painted wood, glass windows with real curtains, a front porch with carved railings. Evelyn climbed the steps and pounded on the door hard enough to rattle it in its frame. A housekeeper answered, her eyes widening at the sight of Evelyn covered in dust and soot, flanked by Cole Brennan with his hand on his gun and Margaret looking like she'd crawled out of hell itself. Miss Mercer, I don't think— Get the mayor, Evelyn said. Now. The housekeeper fled, and a moment later Mayor Ashford appeared, his face arranged in an expression of concerned surprise that didn't quite reach his eyes. Miss Mercer, I heard about the fire. Terrible tragedy. I was just about to send the sheriff to investigate. Save it, Evelyn interrupted. We both know who ordered that fire, and we both know Sheriff Dalton won't investigate anything that might upset Thomas Garrett. I'm here to tell you that you have a choice to make, Mayor. You can keep pretending this town is civilized while it burns down around you, or you can do your job. Ashford's face hardened. I don't appreciate your tone, young lady. And I don't appreciate watching good people die and lose everything they've built while you take bribes to look the other way. Evelyn stepped closer, close enough that he had to either hold his ground or back away. He backed away. There's going to be a gathering tomorrow evening, right here in your house just like you planned. Everyone's invited, the whole town council, every business owner, every rancher who can make it to town. And we're going to lay out evidence of Thomas Garrett's crimes in front of everyone. You can either help make that happen, or you can try to stop it and show everyone exactly whose side you're on. That's not how things are done. That's exactly how things are going to be done. Unless you'd rather explain to the territorial governor why an entire town rose up and lynched one of his prominent citizens without the law lifting a finger to stop it. Ashford's eyes widened. You're talking about mob violence. I'm talking about justice when the official channels have been corrupted beyond use. But you could change that, Mayor. You could stand up right now and say that the law in Salvation Ridge still means something. You could demand a full investigation with the territorial marshal present. You could be the hero who cleaned up this town instead of the coward who let it rot. For a moment, something flickered in Ashford's eyes. Maybe integrity, maybe just political calculation about which side of history he wanted to be on. Then it was gone, replaced by the practiced neutrality of a man who'd survived by never taking a firm stance on anything. I'll consider your request, he said stiffly. You do that. And while you're considering, remember that this town has a long memory. People will remember who stood up when it mattered and who hid behind locked doors hoping the fire wouldn't reach them. Evelyn turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Mayor, if anything happens to me or anyone else who's planning to testify tomorrow, there are copies of all our evidence already on their way to Denver. So whatever Garrett's paying you, it won't be enough to cover what comes next. She walked away before he could respond, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Behind her, she heard the mayor's door slam shut. That was either brilliant or suicidal, Margaret said when they were back on the street. Probably both, Cole agreed. But it worked. You saw his face when you mentioned the territorial governor. He's calculating now, trying to figure out which way to jump. Will he jump our way? Evelyn asked. Depends on whether he's more afraid of Garrett or more afraid of being on the wrong side when this all comes out. Cole glanced back at the mayor's house. Either way, we've forced his hand. He can't stay neutral anymore. They spent the rest of the day spreading word about the gathering, making sure everyone who'd been hurt by Garrett's schemes knew where to be and when. The news traveled fast. By evening, it seemed like everyone in Salvation Ridge was talking about the confrontation that was coming. Evelyn expected Garrett to make another move, to send his men to burn more buildings or threaten more witnesses. But as darkness fell, the town remained quiet. Too quiet. He's planning something, Cole said as they gathered at the boarding house. Their new headquarters, now that Margaret's store was ashes. Garrett's not the type to just sit back and let this happen. Maybe he's confident he can talk his way out of it, Sarah Chen suggested. He's done it before. Not like this. Not with this many witnesses ready to speak against him. Mrs. Chen set down a pot of coffee she'd brewed. He'll try to stop the gathering before it happens. How? Evelyn asked. He can't burn down the mayor's house without making it obvious who's responsible. He doesn't need to burn it down, Margaret said grimly. He just needs to make sure the key witnesses don't make it there alive. The words hung in the air like smoke from her ruined store. Cole stood and checked his rifle. Then we make sure everyone's protected. Tom, Jack, you two gather the ranchers who are coming to town. Travel in groups, armed, and camp on the edge of town tonight instead of trying to find rooms. Mrs. Chen, keep everyone who's testifying here at the boarding house. We'll post guards at the doors and windows. What about you? Margaret asked. I'm going to pay a visit to some friends. Men who aren't fond of Garrett and wouldn't mind the chance to even some old scores. By tomorrow evening, we'll have enough guns on our side that Garrett will think twice about starting a fight. He left through the back door, melting into the darkness like he'd been born to it. Evelyn helped Mrs. Chen and Sarah prepare the boarding house for a siege. They brought in extra water, checked that windows were locked, moved furniture to create barriers. It felt absurd and necessary in equal measure, turning a simple boarding house into a fortress because speaking the truth had become a capital offense. That night, Evelyn barely slept. She lay in a narrow bed in Mrs. Chen's personal quarters, listening to the sounds of the house settling and the guards walking their rounds outside. Somewhere in the darkness, Thomas Garrett was planning. Somewhere, men who killed for money were preparing for violence. And somewhere, she hoped, there were still people in Salvation Ridge who cared more about justice than profit. Dawn came gray and cold, with clouds building on the western horizon that promised rain by evening. Evelyn rose and dressed in the same practical clothes she'd worn to work in Margaret's store. A simple dress, sturdy boots, her hair pulled back in a bun that wouldn't fall loose in a struggle. She looked at herself in the small mirror and saw a stranger. The girl from Philadelphia was completely gone now, replaced by someone harder and clearer, someone who'd learned that survival meant making impossible choices and living with the consequences. Downstairs, she found Margaret already awake and drinking coffee at the kitchen table. The older woman's face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp. "You ready for this?" Margaret asked. "I don't know. How do you get ready to possibly die?" "You don't. You just decide what's worth dying for, and then you don't think about it too much." Margaret poured a second cup of coffee and handed it to Evelyn. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. You came here broken and scared, and look at you now, about to take down the most powerful man in the territory." "We haven't taken him down yet." "No, but we've exposed him, and that's halfway there. Men like Garrett only have power when they operate in shadows. You've dragged him into the light. Whatever happens tonight, that matters." The day crawled past like it was wounded. People arrived throughout the morning. Ranchers riding in with their families, merchants closing their stores early, even a few of Garrett's former employees who'd decided their consciences were worth more than their paychecks. By mid-afternoon, the boarding house was overflowing with people who'd come to bear witness. Cole returned just before sunset, bringing a dozen hard-faced men who carried themselves like soldiers or lawmen, or both. He pulled Evelyn aside while the others took up positions around the building. "The gathering's set for 7 o'clock, he said quietly. Mayor Ashford sent word to Garrett that he's expected to attend and answer questions about his business practices. Garrett sent back a message saying he'll be there with his lawyers and proof that everything you've accused him of is lies." "His lawyers or his guns?" "Both, probably, but we've got something he doesn't know about." Cole's expression was grim and satisfied. Judge Blackwood arrived in town this morning, 2 weeks early. Apparently someone sent him a telegram suggesting his presence would be required for an important legal matter. Evelyn's eyes widened. Someone? Margaret's got friends in surprising places. Point is, there's going to be a territorial judge present tonight, which means anything that gets said becomes part of the official record. Garrett can't make that disappear. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood and copper, they began the walk to Mayor Ashford's house. Evelyn went with Margaret and Cole, surrounded by witnesses and guards who'd committed themselves to this dangerous gamble. Behind them came more people, curious townspeople who'd heard about the confrontation and wanted to see what would happen. By the time they reached the mayor's house, there were perhaps 60 people gathered in the street and on the lawn. The mayor stood on his front porch looking like he desperately regretted ever getting involved in politics. And across the street, sitting on his horse with 6 armed men arrayed behind him, was Thomas Garrett. He'd dressed for the occasion, a fine suit, polished boots, a gold watch chain glinting in the failing light. He looked every inch the respectable businessman except for his eyes. Those were cold and calculating, measuring everyone present and finding them wanting. "Miss Mercer," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the gathered crowd. "I understand you've been spreading some rather serious accusations about my business practices. I thought it only fair that I come here tonight and set the record straight." Evelyn stepped forward, her legs steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Then by all means, Mr. Garrett, come inside and let's discuss those accusations in detail. With witnesses present, of course, and Judge Blackwood, who I see has joined us this evening." Garrett's expression flickered, just for a moment, before smoothing back into confident amusement. But that flicker told Evelyn everything. He hadn't known about the judge, hadn't expected official legal oversight of this confrontation. "Of course," he said smoothly. "I have nothing to hide." He dismounted and walked toward the house, his men following. Cole's men moved to intercept them. "The men stay outside," Cole said flatly. "This is a legal proceeding, not a gunfight." "My associates are here to ensure my safety," Garrett said. "Then they can ensure it from out here. Only principals and witnesses go inside." For a tense moment, it looked like Garrett might push back. Then Judge Blackwood appeared on the porch, a tall man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent 40 years enforcing the law in hard country. "Mr. Garrett," the judge said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "the territorial court will be convening this evening to hear evidence regarding allegations of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. You may bring one attorney if you have one present. Your armed guards will remain outside. Those are the terms. Accept them or be held in contempt." Garrett's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "As you wish, Your Honor, though I must protest this irregular proceeding." "Your protest is noted and overruled. Inside, gentlemen. We have work to do." They filed into Mayor Ashford's parlor, which had been hastily arranged to resemble a courtroom. Chairs faced a desk where Judge Blackwood would preside. A table had been set up for evidence. Windows had been opened despite the cold to allow people outside to hear what was said. Evelyn took her seat among the witnesses, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. Around her sat Margaret, Sarah Chen, Tom Wilson, the widow whose husband had died in the mine, and a dozen others who'd suffered under Garrett's schemes. Across from them, Thomas Garrett sat alone except for a nervous-looking attorney he'd summoned from somewhere. He looked calm and faintly amused, like this was all a minor inconvenience that would soon be cleared up. Judge Blackwood rapped his gavel against the desk. "This hearing will come to order," he said. "We're here to examine serious allegations of criminal conduct. I want to make something very clear. This is not a trial. I don't have the authority to convict or sentence, but I do have the authority to take testimony under oath and forward findings to the territorial prosecutor. What's said here tonight matters. Lying to this court is perjury and will be prosecuted as such. Is that understood?" Murmurs of assent rippled through the room. "Good. Miss Mercer, I understand you're the one who brought these allegations. You'll testify first." Evelyn stood, her heart hammering, and walked to the chair beside the judge's desk. Through the window she could see the crowd outside had grown, easily 100 people now, maybe more, all of them watching and waiting to see if truth would matter in Salvation Ridge. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Then she began to speak. She told them everything. About the wagon train journey west, about Douglas Penworth and the marriage contract that was supposed to clear her father's debts, about the attack that came from the east instead of the west, about men who wore war paint but spoke English, about arrows that looked purchased rather than handmade, about the dying man who used his last breath to tell her the raiders weren't who everyone would assume they were. Her voice remained steady as she described arriving in Salvation Ridge covered in blood and ash, as she recounted Thomas Garrett's first offer to buy her companionship like she was property at auction. She walked the judge through every threat, Every suspicious death, every piece of evidence that pointed to a conspiracy designed to terrorize settlers and profit from their fear. When she finished, the room was silent except for the sound of rain beginning to fall outside, tapping against windows like impatient fingers. Judge Blackwood made notes in his ledger, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Garrett, do you wish to question the witness?" Garrett's attorney stood, a thin man with nervous hands who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Mercer, isn't it true that you arrived in this territory under traumatic circumstances, that you were the sole survivor of a violent attack?" "Yes." "And isn't it possible that in your distressed state you misinterpreted what you saw and heard? That grief and shock have colored your memories?" Evelyn met his eyes. "I know what I saw. I know what that dying man told me. And I know that every question I've asked since arriving in Salvation Ridge has been met with threats, violence, or attempts to silence me permanently. That's not grief talking, that's evidence." The attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Still, you admit you have no direct proof that my client was involved in the wagon train attack." "Not direct proof, no, but I have pattern and motive, and I have ledgers that show exactly how he profited from it." Margaret stood and carried the canvas bag to the evidence table, laying out the copied ledger pages with careful precision. Judge Blackwood leaned forward, studying the columns of numbers while Margaret explained what they represented. "These entries here," Margaret said, pointing, "show payments for security services that coincide exactly with raids on specific ranches. Within days of each raid, those same ranches sold their land at reduced prices to shell companies that Mr. Garrett controls. The pattern repeats 11 times over the past 18 months. "Those are legitimate business transactions," Garrett's attorney protested. "My client provides security services and invests in land. There's nothing illegal about either activity." "Then explain these," Cole Brennan said, stepping forward with another set of documents. "Shipping manifests for military supplies that were billed to Fort Bridger but never arrived. The freight company that was supposed to deliver them is owned by Mr. Garrett through a third party. The supplies disappeared, but the government still paid for them. That's not business. That's theft from the United States Army." Judge Blackwood's expression hardened as he examined the manifests. "These documents appear authentic. Mr. Garrett, do you have records showing these supplies were actually delivered?" For the first time, Garrett spoke directly. "Your Honor, I run multiple business enterprises across this territory. I can't personally verify every shipment, every transaction. If there were discrepancies in the freight operations, that's a matter for the company managers to address." "Convenient," Margaret said coldly. "You profit from the theft but claim no knowledge of it." "I claim no direct involvement in day-to-day operations, which is different from claiming ignorance." Garrett's voice was smooth, practiced. "If crimes were committed by my employees without my knowledge, I'm as much a victim as anyone else." "Then let's talk about crimes you did know about," Evelyn said, standing again. "Like the murder of Deputy Miller." The room went silent. Garrett's expression didn't change. "I had nothing to do with that tragedy." "No. Then explain this." Cole produced a folded telegram, yellowed and worn. "Found this in your warehouse office the same night I acquired your ledgers. It's addressed to someone named Vance, dated the day before Miller was killed. It says, 'Deal with the deputy problem, make it look natural.'" Garrett's attorney lunged forward. "That document was obtained illegally through theft and breaking and entering. It can't be admitted as evidence." "This isn't a criminal trial," Judge Blackwood said sharply. "I'm conducting a preliminary investigation to determine if crimes may have occurred. I'll examine whatever evidence is presented and make my own determination about its validity." He took the telegram and read it slowly, his face darkening. "Mr. Garrett, do you recognize this telegram?" "I've never seen it before." "It was sent from your office." "Then someone used my office without my permission. Your Honor, this entire proceeding is based on stolen documents and wild accusations from witnesses who have clear grudges against me. Miss Mercer is angry because I made her a business proposition she found offensive. Mrs. Hale blames me for her store burning, though there's no evidence I had anything to do with that fire. These people are using this hearing to exact revenge, not seek justice." "Is that what you think?" a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. A woman stood there, rain-soaked and shaking, supported by one of Cole's men. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair and a face that bore fresh bruises. Her dress was torn, and her feet were bare and bleeding. Evelyn recognized her immediately, though she couldn't place from where. Something about the shape of her face, the color of her eyes. "Who are you?" Judge Blackwood asked. The woman stepped forward, her legs barely holding her. "My name is Catherine Miller. I'm Deputy James Miller's sister, and I have something to say about how my brother died." The room erupted in whispers. Catherine Miller swayed, and Evelyn rushed to help her into a chair, bringing water from a pitcher on the evidence table. "Miss Miller," the judge said gently, "you're clearly in distress. Perhaps you should see a doctor before—" "No." Catherine's voice was stronger than her appearance suggested. "I need to say this now before they come for me again." "Before who comes for you?" "Mr. Garrett's men, the ones who've been holding me prisoner for the past 2 weeks." The whispers turned to gasps. Garrett shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. I've never—" "Sit down, Mr. Garrett," Judge Blackwood said, his voice like iron. "Miss Miller, explain what you mean by held prisoner." Catherine took a shaky breath. "After my brother was killed, I started asking questions. James had told me he was investigating something big, something dangerous. He said he had evidence of government supply theft and that he was going to report it to the territorial marshal. 3 days later, he was dead, shot in the back and left in a ravine." "We were told it was Indians," someone from the crowd murmured. "It wasn't Indians. It was white men dressed to look like Indians, the same way the wagon train raiders were." Catherine's hands trembled as she continued. "I found James's notes hidden in his room. He'd documented everything: shipping routes, missing supplies, payments to corrupt officials. He even had the names of the men involved. When I tried to take that evidence to Sheriff Dalton, he told me to go home and grieve, said I was hysterical from loss." "What happened to the evidence?" Cole asked quietly. "I hid it. And that night men came to my house. They said Mr. Garrett wanted to speak with me about my brother, that he was offering condolences and financial support for the family. I was stupid enough to go with them." Her voice broke. "They took me to a ranch outside town, locked me in a room, told me I'd stay there until I agreed to forget everything James had found, everything I knew. They said if I talked, my mother would have an accident too." Garrett's attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is hearsay and slander. There's no proof." "I have proof," Catherine said. She reached into her torn dress and pulled out a folded packet of papers, water-stained but intact. "James's notes. Every name, every transaction, every crime. I've been carrying them since they took me, waiting for a chance to escape." She laid the papers on the evidence table. Judge Blackwood examined them with increasing gravity, his expression growing harder with each page. "These are quite detailed," he said finally. "Deputy Miller was thorough in his investigation. Miss Miller, how did you escape?" "Tonight. I heard the guards talking about what was happening here, about the hearing. I knew if I didn't get out now, I'd never get another chance. So when they brought dinner, I hit one of them with a water pitcher and ran all the way to town in the rain. One of the men outside brought me here when I said I had testimony about my brother's murder." Judge Blackwood turned to Garrett, and his voice could have cut glass. "Mr. Garrett, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you deny holding Miss Miller against her will?" "Absolutely. I've never seen this woman before in my life. If she was held somewhere, it had nothing to do with me." "Then you won't mind if we send men to search your properties for evidence of her confinement." Garrett's jaw tightened fractionally. "Search whatever you like. You'll find nothing." "We'll see." The judge gestured to Cole. "Mr. Brennan, take some men and investigate the ranches Mr. Garrett owns outside town. Look for evidence of recent imprisonment, locked rooms, guards, anything that supports Miss Miller's account." Cole nodded and left quickly, taking several armed men with him. The hearing continued through the night, testimony piling upon testimony. Tom Wilson described how his cattle had been stolen and later found bearing Garrett's brand. Sarah Chen documented the systematic destruction of her mother's freight business through sabotage and intimidation. The widow whose husband died in the mine produced the letter he'd written describing safety violations and threats. Each witness added another piece to the mosaic of corruption, and slowly, inexorably, the full picture emerged. Not just isolated crimes, but a comprehensive campaign to control the territory through violence, fraud, and fear. Garrett's attorney tried to discredit each witness, but the sheer volume of consistent testimony made that impossible. One person might lie, two might coordinate, but 20 people from different backgrounds with different grievances, all describing the same pattern, that was something else entirely. Near midnight, Cole Brennan returned. Rain dripped from his hat as he entered the parlor, his face grim. "Your Honor, we searched the Rocking G Ranch 12 miles northeast of town. Found a locked room on the second floor with a cot, a chamber pot, and bars on the window. Also found 2 guards who ran when they saw us coming. We caught one of them. Bring him in." The man Cole's people dragged in was rough-looking and terrified, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He wore a gun belt and had the bearing of someone who'd done violence for money and expected to do more. "What's your name?" Judge Blackwood asked. "Don't have to tell you nothing." "You're right. You don't. But you should know that kidnapping is a hanging offense in this territory, and we have a witness who can identify you as one of her captors. So you can cooperate now and maybe avoid the noose, or you can stay silent and take your chances with a jury." The man looked at Garrett, some silent question in his eyes. Garrett stared back, his expression cold and empty. Whatever the man saw there made his decision for him. "My name's Keller," he said quietly. "Roy Keller. I was hired to guard the Miller woman, keep her quiet until Mr. Garrett said otherwise." "Did Mr. Garrett personally give you those orders?" Keller hesitated, then nodded. "He came to the ranch 4 days ago, said the woman was hysterical and dangerous to herself, that we were doing her family a kindness by keeping her safe until she calmed down, paid us $50 each." "And you believe that?" "I believe $50. Judge Blackwood made a note. "Mr. Garrett, it appears Mr. Keller is willing to testify that you personally ordered Miss Miller's imprisonment." "He's lying to save himself," Garrett said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "Your Honor, this entire proceeding is a travesty. You're allowing criminals and liars to make accusations without any real proof." "I have proof," Judge Blackwood interrupted. "I have ledgers showing systematic fraud. I have shipping manifests documenting theft from the military. I have testimony from multiple witnesses describing a pattern of violence and intimidation. I have a woman who was held prisoner and a guard who admits to holding her on your orders. And I have a telegram suggesting you ordered the murder of a law enforcement officer." He stood, his face hard as granite. "Mr. Garrett, I'm issuing a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, and suspicion of murder. You'll be held in custody pending trial in the territorial capital." The room exploded in noise, cheers from some, gasps from others. Garrett shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking. "You can't do this! I have friends in Denver, connections in Washington. You're a territorial judge presiding over an illegal hearing based on stolen evidence. This will never stand up in court. Then you'll have the opportunity to prove that at trial. But until then, you're under arrest." Judge Blackwood nodded to the men guarding the doors. "Take him into custody." Garrett's hand moved toward his coat, and for a heart-stopping moment, Evelyn thought he was reaching for a weapon. But what he pulled out was a thick envelope, which he threw on the table in front of the judge. "You want to talk about corruption?" Garrett said, his voice shaking with rage. "Here's a list of every official I've paid off over the past 3 years, including judges, marshals, and territorial administrators. You think you're going to bring me down? I'll bring down half the government with me. Every dirty secret, every bought vote, every piece of leverage I have, it all becomes public if I go to trial." Judge Blackwood picked up the envelope and looked inside, his expression unreadable. Then he set it down carefully. "Mr. Garrett, I've been a judge in this territory for 22 years. I've seen men like you before, men who think money and connections make them untouchable, who believe everyone has a price and every institution can be corrupted. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes the system is so rotten that justice becomes impossible." He paused. "But not today. Today, you're going to face consequences for what you've done. And if that means exposing corruption in high places, then so be it. This territory deserves better than bought judges and murdered deputies." He turned to the guards. "Take him, and make sure he's watched carefully. I suspect he's the type to try buying his way out of a locked cell." As Garrett was led away, still protesting, still making threats, the crowd outside erupted in cheers that could be heard through the rain. Evelyn sat back in her chair, suddenly exhausted, barely able to process that it was over. Margaret appeared at her shoulder, squeezing her hand. "You did it. You actually did it." "We did it," Evelyn corrected. "All of us." Judge Blackwood approached them, his expression softer than it had been during the hearing. Miss Mercer, I want you to know that what you did tonight took extraordinary courage. Most people would have accepted Garrett's first offer or left town rather than fight. You chose to stand up, to demand justice, and you made it impossible for the rest of us to look away. I just told the truth, Your Honor. The truth has power when someone's brave enough to speak it in the right place at the right time. You did that. He glanced at the ledgers and documents spread across the table. I'll be recommending that the territorial prosecutor bring a full case against Garrett and everyone named in his list of paid officials. This is going to shake things up considerably in Denver. Good, Margaret said firmly. About time someone shook things up. The hearing broke up near dawn, people spilling out into rain that had gentled to a drizzle. Evelyn stood on the mayor's porch, watching them go. Ranchers heading back to their spreads, merchants returning to their stores, families who'd come to bear witness, now free to go home knowing justice had been served, at least for tonight. Cole Brennan appeared beside her, looking as exhausted as she felt. You should get some rest. It's been a long night. It's been a long month, Evelyn said. I'm not sure I remember what rest feels like. You'll remember. Give it time. He smiled slightly. What are you going to do now? Stay in Salvation Ridge or head back east? It was a question she'd been avoiding since the moment she arrived. Philadelphia seemed like another world, another life entirely. The girl who'd left there to marry a stranger and clear her father's debts was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned to fight and survive and demand justice in a hard land. I don't know yet, she admitted. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not running or fighting. Fair enough. Well, if you decide to stay, Margaret's going to need help rebuilding her store, and I suspect this town could use someone who's not afraid to ask hard questions and demand real answers. He tipped his hat and walked away into the gray dawn, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. 3 days later, Catherine Miller knocked on the door of the boarding house where Evelyn was staying. She looked better than she had during the hearing, clean, dressed in borrowed clothes, the bruises on her face starting to fade. I wanted to thank you, Catherine said. If you hadn't pushed for this hearing, if you hadn't made everyone listen, I'd probably still be locked in that room. Or worse. I'm just glad you're safe, Evelyn said. What will you do now? Stay here, I think. My mother needs me, and James deserves to have someone who'll make sure he's remembered properly. Not as just another deputy killed by Indians, but as a lawman who died trying to expose corruption. Catherine hesitated. I was also thinking, this town's going to need a new sheriff once Dalton's arrested for being on Garrett's payroll. Someone honest, someone who actually cares about the law. Cole Brennan would be good at it, but he's not the type to stay in one place. You think you could do it? Maybe. I learned a lot from James about how to investigate, how to follow evidence, and I'm tired of women being told they're too delicate or hysterical to handle violence. We handle it every day. We just don't get credit for it. Catherine smiled slightly. Besides, who better to clean up this town than someone who's seen exactly how dirty it can get? Evelyn found herself smiling back. I think you'd make an excellent sheriff. Over the following weeks, Salvation Ridge began to change. Garrett was transported to the territorial capital under heavy guard, along with Sheriff Dalton and 3 members of the town council who'd been named in his list of corrupt officials. The territorial prosecutor opened investigations into everyone Garrett had implicated, sending shockwaves through Denver's political establishment. Judge Blackwood stayed in town longer than his usual circuit, personally overseeing the transition of power and making sure no one tried to fill the vacuum Garrett left with more corruption. He appointed Catherine Miller as acting sheriff, a decision that scandalized some but earned grudging respect from most once they saw how efficiently she worked. Margaret rebuilt her store with help from townspeople who showed up with lumber and nails and labor, grateful for everything she'd done to expose Garrett's crimes. The new building was smaller than the old one, but sturdier, built to last. Cole Brennan stayed around longer than Evelyn expected, helping Catherine establish order and training a few young men who wanted to become deputies. He seemed restless, though, like a man who'd stopped moving only temporarily and would soon need to be on the trail again. One evening, as summer heat settled over the plains, Evelyn stood outside the new mercantile and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of copper and gold. The town felt different now, louder, more alive, like something that had been holding its breath for years could finally exhale. "Penny for your thoughts," Margaret said, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. Evelyn accepted one and sipped it, savoring the bitter heat. "Just thinking about how different this place is from when I arrived. How different I am." "You were always this person," Margaret said. "You just didn't know it yet. Took the right circumstances to bring it out. Or the wrong circumstances. Sometimes those are the same thing." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I got a letter today from Philadelphia. Your father's asking about you, wants to know if you're planning to come home." Evelyn had been expecting this. She'd written him once after the hearing, a brief note explaining she was alive and well, but giving no details about what had happened. Now he wanted her back, probably to try arranging another marriage to clear whatever new debts he'd accumulated. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing yet. Figured you should decide what you want to say." Margaret studied her. "You could go back, you know. You've got money now. Judge Blackwood ruled that you're entitled to Douglas Penworth's estate since you were legally betrothed. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to live on. Start fresh somewhere if you want." The idea felt strange. She'd come west as payment for her father's debts, and now she had actual wealth in her own name. Freedom bought with tragedy, but freedom nonetheless. "I'm not going back," Evelyn said, surprising herself with how certain she sounded. "Philadelphia is someone else's life, someone who doesn't exist anymore. I belong here." "Doing what? You can't work in my store forever." "No, but I've been thinking about that. This town needs a lot of things. A proper school, a library, maybe even a newspaper so people have access to real information instead of rumors and lies. I could help build those things. Use Penworth's money for something that matters." Margaret smiled. "I think you'd be good at that. Though I warn you, starting institutions in a frontier town is even harder than fighting corrupt businessmen. I've had practice with hard things." They stood together watching the light fade. 2 women who'd survived violence and grief and had chosen to build something better from the ashes. Around them, Salvation Ridge settled in for another night. Not perfect, not without problems, but honest in a way it hadn't been when Evelyn first arrived. A month later, Catherine Miller officially became Salvation Ridge's first female sheriff, appointed by the territorial governor himself after Judge Blackwood's recommendation. Her first act was to hire 2 deputies who'd been among the witnesses at Garrett's hearing, men who'd proven they cared more about justice than profit. Cole Brennan left town on a Tuesday morning, riding north toward Montana with a casual wave and a promise to stop by if his travels ever brought him back this way. Evelyn watched him go with mixed feelings, gratitude for everything he'd done, and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. Thomas Garrett's trial became a sensation across the territory. He tried to bargain, offering to testify against his partners in exchange for leniency, but the prosecutor had enough evidence that they didn't need his cooperation. The trial lasted 3 weeks and revealed corruption so widespread that it forced the resignation of 2 territorial officials and a federal quartermaster. Garrett was convicted on 17 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and kidnapping. The murder charge for Deputy Miller couldn't be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The telegram was circumstantial, and Keller recanted his testimony after receiving threats. But the other convictions carried a sentence of 30 years in the territorial prison. He'd be an old man before he saw freedom again, if he lived that long. The news reached Salvation Ridge on a warm September evening. Catherine Miller read the verdict aloud in the town square, and people cheered like it was Independence Day. That night someone played fiddle music in the street, and folks danced until late, celebrating not just Garrett's conviction, but the victory of ordinary people over powerful corruption. Evelyn didn't dance. Instead, she sat on the steps of the new mercantile with Margaret, watching the celebration with quiet satisfaction. "You ever regret it?" Margaret asked. "Fighting instead of running? Staying here instead of going back to Philadelphia, where life would have been easier?" Evelyn thought about the girl who'd arrived in a blood-stained wedding dress, terrified and alone. About the journey from victim to witness to someone who'd helped bring down a criminal empire. About everything she'd lost and everything she'd become. "Not for a second," she said. By winter, the school Evelyn had proposed was under construction, funded partly by Penworth's estate and partly by donations from grateful townspeople. She'd hired a teacher from Denver, a young woman with progressive ideas about education who believed girls deserved the same learning opportunities as boys. The newspaper was harder, printing presses were expensive, and editors were scarce, but Evelyn was patient. She knew how to wait, how to work toward something worth having, how to build things that lasted. On Christmas Eve, snow fell soft and thick over Salvation Ridge, transforming the rough frontier town into something almost beautiful. Evelyn stood at the window of her small house, purchased with her own money, bearing her own name on the deed, and watched lamplight glow in windows up and down the street. She thought about Douglas Penworth sometimes, the man she'd been supposed to marry, wondered what kind of life they would have had if the raiders hadn't come, if she'd arrived in Salvation Ridge as a bride instead of a survivor. Probably she would have been miserable, trapped in a marriage to a stranger, her life shaped by his decisions, her voice silenced by the assumption that wives should be seen and not heard. The raiders had destroyed that future, and in its place, she'd built something better. Not perfect, not without scars, but entirely her own. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Catherine Miller standing there, snowflakes catching in her dark hair. "Evening, Sheriff?" Evelyn said with a smile. "Evening. Thought you might want some company on Christmas Eve. Margaret's making dinner for a few of us, and she sent me to fetch you." "Lead the way." They walked through falling snow to Margaret's rebuilt store, where warmth and light spilled from the windows. Inside, Evelyn found a gathering of people who'd become something like family. Margaret and Sarah Chen, Tom Wilson and Jack Sutter, Cole Brennan, who'd surprised everyone by returning for the holiday, and a dozen others who'd stood together when it mattered. They ate roasted chicken and potatoes, shared stories and laughter, toasted absent friends and future victories. And when someone asked Evelyn to talk about Philadelphia, about her life before the frontier, she found she had almost nothing to say. That person belonged to another world, another story entirely. This was her story now. Not the tale of a girl sold into marriage to pay her father's debts, but the story of a woman who'd survived violence, demanded justice, and helped transform a corrupt town into something better. A woman who'd learned that true freedom wasn't about escaping hardship, but about choosing how to face it. As the evening wound down and people began heading home through the snow, Margaret pulled Evelyn aside. "I have something for you," she said, handing over a folded piece of paper. Evelyn opened it and found a deed, for the lot next to Margaret's store, signed over to her name. "What's this?" "Your newspaper office, once you're ready to build it. Figure you'll want to be close by so we can argue about what stories deserve printing and which ones are just gossip." Margaret smiled. "Besides, you're family now. Family looks out for each other." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears. The kind that came from gratitude and belonging and knowing you'd found your place in the world. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see how much trouble a newspaper can cause in a town like this." Margaret squeezed her shoulder. "But I figure if anyone can handle trouble, it's you." That night, Evelyn walked home through snow that had transformed Salvation Ridge into something almost magical. The rough edges were softened, the violence and struggle temporarily hidden beneath pristine white, but she knew they were still there, would always be there. The frontier was a hard place that demanded hard choices. She'd learned to make those choices, learned to stand when it would be easier to run, to speak when it would be safer to stay silent, to build when it would be simpler to leave. The girl from Philadelphia was gone, burned away in prairie fire and forged into someone stronger in the crucible of survival. What remained was Evelyn Mercer of Salvation Ridge, witness, survivor, builder of futures not assigned but chosen. She looked up at the Wyoming sky, snow falling soft against her face, and smiled. This was home. Hard-won, blood-bought, and entirely her own. And she wouldn't trade it for anything.